So, just a few words to welcome Professor Marie in the name of the Department of Humanities of the University of Trento. I'm very happy and proud to have Professor Marie here with us. And I'd like to express our gratitude for coming here and discuss with us the problems and the perspectives regarding the computer gaming. We normally think, or better, I normally think about computer gaming as fun, but what is important today is to think about the computer game also as an opportunity for education, for job, for marketing, and so on. And the participation of Professor Marie to our discussion has a particular meaning because we are discussing as a department about the perspective of developing something about computer gaming, and we have to think it over, we have to discuss, we have to understand which perspectives we have, and I think the contribution of an expert, international expert as Professor Marie, can be precious and very, very important to us to better understand what we can do and what we want to do. I'm just sad that I have to run away because my students wait for me at the lesson, but I discussed the question with Professor Marie yesterday, and I'm very, very sure that we will do it again in the next days, weeks, and months. So thank you again, and thank you. You're welcome. Yes. Thanks.
Okay, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Frédéric Lemarie. I know Frédéric since a few years when we regularly met at Mittel Europa Foundation within a group of scientists and philosophers discussing about shape and vision. Now, we consider us to be a little bit of pioneers in a new point of view in vision science, and we discussed it and share what we thought on shape, to use the title of one of these people. We focused on seeing, what does it mean, seeing, actual seeing, and there was a mixture of science, philosophy, and art. And now we discussed how to represent seeing from a computational and a mathematical viewpoint. So you understand why the event has been sponsored by the Department of Humanities and CIMEC, the Center for Mind and Brain. Now, Frédéric worked in Montreal Medical University on visual perception, biomedical imagery, and general artificial intelligence. Then he moved to Brown University and was co-founder of the Shape Laboratory, which means digital modeling with application to archaeology, again, and cultural heritage, again, this wonderful mixture between science and humanities. Currently, he works at Goldsmith College at University of London, where he co-directs a master at the frontier of perception, realism, imagination, and digital creativity, which now has become a Master of Fine Arts in Computational Studio Arts. And that's the magic images. Can we go on? As from the point of view of research, Lemarie is developing a mathematical language for shape representation, which has a potential application in various domains and industries, such as art and performance areas, to biology, medicine, computer-aided design, architecture, archaeology, and more. So again, the mixture between science and arts and humanities. I will mention only two projects actually occurring at Goldsmith. One is the ICON project, Autonomous Artistic Iconograph, named Paul the Robot. It's a project using computational techniques to examine the activity of drawing and in particular sketching the human face. And it puts together knowledge about our perceptual and other neurobiological systems, and the more recent progresses in computational hardware, computer vision, and artificial intelligence, to the goal to the sophisticated computational simulation of at least some of the identifiable perceptual and cognitive processes involved in face sketching by artists. And it is developed in collaboration with Patrick Tressé. Next slide. The second project I would like to mention is the project Autograph on graffiti arts. Autograph focuses on the computational generation of forms, shapes, based on the style and process involved in drawing graffiti letters. It is based on the direct experience of Daniel Berrio as a graffiti artist and analyzes the process that he follows when sketching. And this leads to the construction of generative models that abstract the main components of the process and of the style under analysis. So the collaboration in this case is with Berrio, the artist himself. And the final one, we got not only obviously the sponsorship of the Department of Humanities and of CIMEC, but also of Unisport. I like to recall it because Frederick himself obviously is a video game, the video game player, but also swims, ride bicycle, go hiking, skiing, and surely something else that I don't know. So he's a player at full extent. Thank Frederick. If you want to come here, up to you.
It's great to be in Trento again. Beautiful region, and I wish I was here more often because then I could go cycling and swimming and all that. I must say in London it's a bit hard to do all these things. I used to do most of these things when I was at Brown, which is also a great place to do sport and science. So, games, yes. We're going to talk a lot about games today, and I'm going to try to emphasize initially these aspects. So one of the messages I would like to give you is that computer games, sometimes it's called video games. This is more the sort of history of where it came from. In fact, you could really trace it back to regular games, board games, card games, puzzles, role games, very important. We'll come back to that. Role games, I remember when I was a young student, so this is the 80s, we were playing Dungeons and Dragons. I don't know if maybe you still play that, I don't know. And this has influenced a lot what happened at that time where video games, eventually called computer games, came to life. Yes, so, okay, I'm going to try to use my mouse, so be patient with me. I hope it works okay and I don't have to go back too much. So, of the different topics I want to cover, I want also to give you the idea that computer games is beyond entertainment, is a multidisciplinary field, and beside being multidisciplinary, it is also interdisciplinary. So you will see, I hope you will understand that the way computer games are made today, you have to actually bring these disciplines together, and they have to collaborate. Sometimes you even have people who wear many hats, so they can be an artist but doing some programming, or the vice versa. And that's the context of making a game, but then games themselves can be thought in different ways and applied in different worlds. And one of the worlds that's maybe picking up speed in the last few years is this idea of gamification. So here I try to put some words to explain what can we mean by gamification. It is a term that's still a bit imprecise. It probably will be refined over the years. I will give you a few examples of what this may mean. You probably have come across it before. But essentially, we want to apply the experience, the knowledge we have from computer games as an industry, a very successful industry, and try to apply these ideas in other disciplines which traditionally you may not think of as playful or entertaining. So definitely in computer games today, you have a lot of techniques about how to keep you interested in what you're doing, which is playing the game, usually. And so this is a concept that, an experience that we will try to bring into, for example, let's say an application in education. So, you know, sometimes it might be a bit difficult to learn about a new topic from a book. And could we rethink how we could combine learning from a book into learning from a book plus some game aspect linked to the content of the book. Games itself, as you will see later in my talk, is an extremely successful industry, and it's an industry that keeps growing, and there's a lot of different markets today. So maybe 10, 15 years ago, you could say that computer games was only a few areas. You would see only a few types of games, board games, war games, and maybe running and sort of driving games were sort of the main types. But today it is completely a different story, and you have a large diversity of games, and it goes from sports. We were talking about sports. That has become very important in recent years, partly because we have new means of interacting with computers, including by just moving around, and the computer is able to see what you do. A large recent market is the mobile market, which, yes, I will tell you a little bit more, hopefully later, what's different with that market. Depending on the kind of game you play, so if you think of a puzzle game, there may not be a huge impact of the storyline. But in general, when a complex game is produced, the storyboard is a very important part of how you're going to create that game. So that will have a huge impact throughout the life of development of a game. So lots of inputs from sort of the literature world and the theater world into creating games. And then there's also, of course, the aspect of technologies. For those who are familiar with the area of computer graphics in the 90s used to have a huge impact and be driven by another industry, which is the industry of special effects for films. So in the 90s, Hollywood would make demands on computer graphics, or would use state-of-the-art computer graphics and sort of drive the agenda. And this has shifted since the 90s, and computer games is now playing that role. So computer games today drives the agenda more and more in the area of technology called computer graphics. So much so that, for example, companies who make graphics chips like NVIDIA or Intel actually consult with the main game producers such as Sony or Microsoft in order to prepare their next chip so that it will sustain the demand of the next games. A game, by the way, a big game like Grand Theft Auto series will take 4, sometimes 5 years to produce, will cost in the hundreds of millions of dollars. We'll talk about that later. And you can imagine that this kind of complexity may have an impact on other industries such as hardware for graphics. More recently, and again I will talk a little bit about this domain. You probably heard of this buzzword called big data. Well, if we think of spying on the web, that's, I guess, relevant to big data. And this is also having an influence and mixing with the area of computer games, essentially in the context of visualization. So gamification as an example, a good example, there's this game called, well, it's not quite a game actually, Galaxy Zoo. Anybody has heard of or played or tried Galaxy Zoo here? No? No? Nobody? No? No? Okay. Ah, yeah, a few. Great. Okay. Good. So Galaxy Zoo launched now 7 years ago. So what's the context? It's not a traditional game context. The need here is that there's too much data to deal with. The field is astronomy. The reason is hardware like Hubble telescope up in the sky. There are other sensors now as well that are sort of replacing what Hubble used to do. And there'll be more in the future. So there's more and more data coming. This data today is now digitized from the start. It's just piling up. There's not enough scientists to look at this data and make sense of it. They need help. So there's not enough scientists around the world, that is. So because of that sort of pressure, and because also the technology of games became portable to applications on the web, the idea was, can we use people who go on the web and try to interest them in helping us? And this has happened, and Galaxy Zoo is probably one of the most successful such examples. I will give some other examples later. And you've had, so the last time I checked, which is a few months ago, they were advertising that they had people logging in Galaxy Zoo had helped science to do lots of classifications. So what does the problem look like? It looks like this. So in this particular case, it's all about galaxies. You probably know now that we observe billions of galaxies, and the more we look, the more we find. And they take, so the first step in this context is, what kind of galaxy do I have? And it's a fairly simple classification task. It's this kind of task. So you have here they're giving you a queue that are different main types of galaxy forms, and they're asking the user to select which of these forms they think correspond to a new galaxy that they've registered from the, let's say, the Hubble telescope. And you can, like that, go through different steps. Once you have one type of galaxy, then there can be subtypes, and you walk through sort of levels. This idea of levels is very familiar when you look at how a computer game is designed. And then because it's on the web, there's a notion of how well you're doing, how much you're helping, and comparing how you work with your friends on the web. So Galaxy Zoo, again, is a good example of how you may help a particular area of science. And as a game, it's a fairly simple one. It's really about the interaction with images. The images are essentially presented to you in 2D fashion. In the future, this might become more three-dimensional. And we will see later that there are other similar applications where the game concept is more involved, where there's more work to do in order to create an application. Now, you could think, looking at these examples of galaxies, that this should be a simple problem to solve by a computer. Well, it turns out that even this kind of vision problem, Liliana mentioned we're doing a lot of work in vision area. Well, even this kind of problem where, look at these galaxies, they look fairly easy to characterize, flatten, ellipse, etc. Well, a computer cannot do this task automatically today in a robust fashion, or not easily. Part of the reason is that if you look at what computer vision does these days, they're still trying to find essentially solid shapes with very well-defined contours. And when you look at these images, where are the contours? So that's the kind of puzzle in AI that remains unsolved. Hence, let's ask humans to do the task instead. And of course, you have to make it enjoyable experience. So this is sort of the challenge of gamifying such tasks. So this was a sort of an intro to gamification. And again, I want to give you the sense that we can think of how to apply computer games in different domains by emphasizing different disciplines where they intersect. They definitely all intersect in the making of a game, but then a game itself can feed into these other areas. So the area of art and design is very, very important in making games. And it's actually, if you look at the team, how many people you have making a usual game, about a third of your team is going to be made of artists, designers. When we say artists in the context of game, we mean people who have done traditional art, drawing, sculpting, etc., and have also learned to transfer these skills in the context of using digital tools like 3D Studio Max, Maya, tools you may have heard of that allow you to create artistic content but in a digital way, digital format. And in the context of creating a game, the art is really how you're going to experience the visual aspects, and if you think of design, it's going to be how you experience playing the game itself. So the designers, when we say design in the context of a game, we really mean the aspect of playing the game, and when we say artist, is the aspect of mainly how the game looks like. We could put into this area also sonification, music as well, and animation. Speaking of animation, so in this side of making games, characters are one of the main components that require lots of work, and these characters, they may be avatars, that is, characters that the user will embody and use as a character in the game and drive the character. And this is, in particular, the making of these avatars is where you have a close intersection between the programming team and the artist team, because, okay, the artist will sort of make how it looks, and the programmer will give you the features and the capacity that you may have in the context of a game. And the two types of people have to work closely together to make it work in the end. And you have also a lot of work in making characters which are called non-playing characters, is the typical word used in the industry, or NPCs. So these are characters that will be in your game, but they are not controlled by a human. In this is a very interesting area also for programming, because, and we will talk a little more about that later, as time goes by, these non-playing characters start showing behaviors that are more and more believable, and in the context of games, we would say this is the area of games where games intersect with AI. So if you hear about AI in games, it's not your usual type of AI that you would find in computer science, but it's AI quite specific and usually related to animating characters such that they look like they are believable. And as time goes by, well, this you see more and more of interesting non-playing characters. So much so that sometimes it's hard initially to say, is this a human playing or is this the machine playing against me or for me? So in a usual game, you'll have teams. You'll play with other characters, and again, yes, some of these might be automated, and some of these will be humans. Typically in a game, it's usually identified whether they're humans or automated, because often you want to work with your friends. So an example here, I picked that one to illustrate the type of art quality, although it's actually a bit old, but partly because we work. So Rebellion is a well-known studio in the UK, and we've been working with them for a few years. So I wanted to bring that up. So maybe here I could make a little break and tell you a little bit about computer games in the UK. So computer games, if you look at the history, started in mainly 3 countries around the world in the 70s and then 80s. And those 3 countries were the UK in Europe, Japan, and the US. And if you look at the status of computer game today, where are the main countries very active? Those 3 countries are still the main countries. In Europe, definitely the UK in terms of how many companies you have. But some other countries are slowly catching up, like Germany is doing very well lately. Scandinavian countries as well. And Japan and US are definitely still number 1 and 2. Some other countries have come up from nowhere. So actually, where I come from in Montreal, Canada, when I left, 94, there was almost nothing. And now it's one of the main hub in the world. So this situation is evolving very rapidly. So we could imagine that in Trento or Italy in a few years, it becomes a major hub with respect to the UK and challenge the UK position. Right, so I told you a little bit about gamification. I will come back with some other examples later. We talked a little bit about the importance of art and design. Again, I'm going to come back to these topics through the talk. Another topic to think about when we think of games is that you can think of it as being across media discipline, so multidisciplinary by definition almost. Games now influence even films and video, and vice versa. So you see games that are made, for example, after a film with certain characters, and you see films being made nowadays based on famous characters emerging from the history of computer games. So for example, Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, was first popularized in games, and later was turned into a movie character, famously played, at least initially, by Angelina Jolie. So you can see that these crossings have already occurred clearly in film and video, and these are worlds where, because of the importance of special effects in film and video, in fact, one could think that there's more and more going to be convergence between these disciplines. So, for example, again, where I am positioned in London, we have a lot of dealings with different companies. I mentioned Rebellion. But in the London area, there's also quite a few companies who make special effects for films. So sometimes we visit them, and if you compare the way they organize themselves, it's quite similar to when you go to a game studio. You have large open floors, so floors like here or much larger, and you have teams of people working together. And the disciplines, there's usually no well-defined boundaries. So you will have in the same space designers, artists, programmers, and they tend to organize themselves by little groups, and these groups relate to what are they doing in the context, for example, of a movie, or what is the function of their team in the context of the game, and it's heterogeneous in that way. It is not with clear, well-defined boundaries. Music sonification as another media that's important in relation to games, and so of course, like movies, sonification music will have a big role to play in experiencing a game. But I would say that this is an area, from my experience, that is still playing a rather a smaller role in the context of making games, and I could imagine that in the future it could play a much larger role. This is also by discussions I've had with people in the industry, that this is a bit left on the side in the context of making a game as sort of something you have to do but could be explored more and exploited more. Marketing advertising, that's more of a new area for computer games having an impact. So again, from experience in London, where you find companies in that industry advertising, we've started to see that there's interest in them looking at games as a new media for them to try to use and provide to their clients. So, and you may have noticed that you see occasionally advertising of a new product. There will be a usual campaign. It will be in publishing. It will be on TV, etc. In movie theater, but also you will start seeing small games appearing in connection to launching a new product. And we've seen some of these advertising companies actually designing and offering to their clients small games. I think this is partly linked with the development of the mobile platform as one of the new platforms where you can have games. on these platforms, and that's sort of going in unison with advertising on these platforms. In publishing, I think that's probably one of these other areas like music where lots of potential for the future. There's a little bit done mainly in the area of educational games in relation to traditional publishing. But I could see again more in the future. For example, think of fiction writing, science fiction writing. You could try to have these two types of discipline merge more in the near future. And probably other, as well as other disciplines. So just a few examples. We think, we hear a lot about games for adults, young adults, teenagers, but there's also a huge and developing market for kids. So there are companies who only make games for kids, and in fact, it's so specialized that they will specialize, the companies will be specialized for age groups, certain age groups. So they have even age groups I've seen, like they call, how do they call them? Twins, which is between teenagers and younger kids. So here's just some examples. You have games available mainly on mobile platforms these days, tablets for very young babies. A lot of these games are meant for helping in learning. And it goes through, really, they target age, when I say age group, it's not just like 2 to 8, like I've illustrated here, but they will have, you will see games like if you go shopping for clothing for a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, etc. So this is yet another example here, a game which is helping children to improve language skills. And this particular one is a science fiction setup where you have some robots around. Some are helping you, some are you have to sort of get rid of. And as you go towards teenage, you see more elaborate games. So here's a recent one which is more historical in nature and allows you to explore history. So it can be, depending on the concept of the game, it can be actually very closely related to, let's say, history, or it can be imaginative. This one is a cross between the two. Education. Well, already in what I've said, I think you've got a sense that games are already having a big impact on education. And this, what I've listed there are more other domains where I think there are huge opportunities and there's already some activity, but there could be a lot more in the future. And well, I put programming first. So the masters that we organized in Goldsmith, University of London, is a masters which is providing students with skills to enter the industry, mainly as programmers. And by experience, in the computer science department, it turns out that using games as a context is, in fact, a good way to bring people into computer science and learn about programming. So you can even think of a degree focused around games as leading people to learn, as a good way to learn about programming and not necessarily after that continue towards the game industry, but actually use these good skills in for other topics, including some of the topics that follow. Right, I could say a lot more about each of them, but I'm not going to go now too much detail. Later on, I'll emphasize a project, for example, that relates to urban design. Liliana mentioned archaeology before. There's natural intersections between archaeology and games world. Again, Lara Croft Tomb Raider is one example. And education is also, yes, high education, university education, and slowly you see the game discipline starting to grow as a discipline recognized as valid discipline to do research. This is very recent. When I started in that field, looking at it seriously, which was now about 9 years ago, there were almost no conferences specialized on related to games. You wouldn't see a conference that would put games in the main subject. In fact, people in computer science were sort of shying away from it, considering it as non-serious area to do science. This has changed rapidly, and again, it's partly because I think the disciplines have realized that actually computer games now is driving part of the agenda in some of the computer science disciplines. Graphics is one in general, rendering, but you have also interactions has become largely driven by what's coming out of the game industry. Before, at the beginning, I mentioned big data, and this is definitely also another area where you can take expertise developed in the context of a game and transfer it and apply it to research problems in non-game per se disciplines. So as an example, we've been working with a team at Imperial College. Imperial College in London is one of the main colleges for science and medicine. They have a huge activity in bioscience, and we've been working with a team there, Professor Michael Sternberg, who specializes in the world of proteins and genomics. And if you look at what has happened in that world, especially a few years ago, well, they were doing very sophisticated applied mathematics, dealing with lots of data, complicated data, and because of the progress in genomics, they had the big data problem a long time ago. But in terms of visual experience, it's been quite limited, and they had not intersected with graphics in interesting ways. So that was the motivation to work with them. And we had a first presentation at SIGGRAPH in 2007. This was I didn't bring it up here, but it's actually, you should look it up. It's quite interesting. We developed with them an idea of how could you navigate through the phylogenetic tree. So this is also called the tree of life. The idea was today we can describe precisely the genomic sequence of proteins that you find in all living species. And what we did is we took two protein sequences that you find in your body. One was in your islands, that you find in your islands, and the other one is, I have to remember now, it's in your liver. And it turns out that these two sequence proteins have a common ancestor that's known hundreds of millions of years ago, that they had a common ancestor. And you can, they have tools to extrapolate backward in time and find how these sequences have likely changed, mutated over time. So you can actually find a particular path through the tree of life and go back and forth. And we use that knowledge to create an animation, a 3D animation that basically allows you to traverse the phylogenetic tree as if it were a kind of traversal of a science fiction like 3D world. So this might give you ideas later to exploit. More recently with them, we then looked at visualization of protein data, which would be more realistic and would use more of the technology that we have already available in games. So in games, for example, there is this subdomain called physics in games. Physics in games is not your usual physics, or if you want, it's a much smaller part of physics. It's essentially Newtonian physics, mostly. There's also a bit of fluid dynamics in there that's used. So it's all about interactions, how things might collide, how forces of friction, gravity, these kinds of concepts. Initial, if you want, 101 physics. And you can, and in the computer games industry, because you have to create real-time software, so software that will react in real time and is believable from a physics point of view, they are actually, this is where you will find the most sophisticated implementations. So it's actually very interesting to take what they have and then use it in, for example, the world of proteins, and you will probably have the best possible interaction in that context. So what you see here looks a bit fancy, but for those who are familiar with computational chemistry, so these are typical visualizations in proteins. You have to think of a protein is actually a shoelace. It's like a shoelace that folds in space. And when it folds in space, it takes particular subshapes. So one of the typical subshapes is these spirals, helices, they're called alpha helices. So here we're representing them as red spirals, and the green part that you see, they're called beta sheets. They're essentially parts of your folding protein that are parallel in space, but by parallel we don't mean necessarily straight, but they're nearby and following the same direction. And these are the two main what's called secondary structures. So this is sort of typical chemistry. And what we did here is we brought this 3D view of a protein, which is an abstraction. This is not reality, right? If you look at the molecules, or if you try to interpret what the molecules are like, they occupy space, they're more like bubbles, and in fact, they don't have a well-defined surface. But in terms of the science, we have to sort of abstract that and try to make sense of it. So this is recognized as a valid representation, and we combine this with another representation they use, which is a 2D matrix. I won't say too much about it now, but we can talk about it later if you're interested. But essentially, this is like a flat surface, and what you see here, these lines, and you may see, I don't know, from the back, there are different colors. Essentially, it carries the same information that you have in the 3D view, but instead of, in the 3D view, it's difficult to take part of the protein, another part, and try to see how close are they. While the 2D view is like a projection of how positions are related. And where you see these lines, we've put a force so that they are connected. And where you see a change of color, it means that the proteins are, sub parts of the proteins are coming together closer. So, and we've explored more artistic visualizations here you see, but again, I'm not going to go into too much details, but I'll show you, sorry, I think I'm going to have to go on the computer. I'll show you an illustration of that, what I mean in dynamics, with a little demo, a little video, if I can manage this. So, yes. So again, collaboration with Imperial College. One of the members, not at UCL, another. So these are typical visualizations in the context of chemistry. So these are all available real-time. You can interact with them. So all this aspect of being real-time, interacting, having some physics, exploring different visualization, think of that as the impact of the world of games and graphics into a different discipline. So here is where we bring this 2D view, and you can interact. So all the patterns that you see here relate to the shape and substructure in the protein. And again, I'm not going to explain more about that because it would take too much time. So you can navigate, traverse the 3D world of a protein in different ways. You can undo the attraction forces in a protein, which we will do here in a second. Yes, so here we removed all the forces, so the shoelace view becomes more apparent, and you can think of that as a traversal of the DNA that relates to a particular protein. And then we introduce slowly the forces. So you can create these animation, it's quite interactive, and you can study a typical protein like this one, which is quite complicated, and this is not even a very complicated protein, right? So, but in 3D, very difficult to imagine what are the, or see, or explain the 3D structures. Here, a different visualization for another complex, and you can actually use this tool in different ways. So this is a traversal, step by step, through the protein. Again, another way of navigating through the data. You can also use this tool to do design of interesting forms, new forms that are not necessarily observed in nature. Yeah, that's the part. So here we are using the tool completely in a creative manner. Now it's completely outside the scope of chemistry, and we, inspired by the chemistry, we have this interface, but now we're using it in a more creative way, creating new designs. So let me stop this for now. Sorry, how much more time do I have? Okay, thanks. So you can think of this particular piece of work also as yet another example of this idea of gamification, where we're taking some of the ideas and technologies of game, here more the interactivity and some of the physics and graphics technology, and importing it directly into a different discipline, computational chemistry. And yes, a theme to emphasize, I gave you an example before, which was Galaxy Zoo. There is a crossing between these gamification experiments and also now crowdsourcing. And this is because there's a convergence with the internet. So the games now, if you gamify a problem, you can actually make it available to a large number of people. If you're able to design your applications such that it is playful or entertaining, then there's the potential to actually attract to you a lot of people who might engage into helping you to solve a particular problem. So that's the crowdsourcing phenomenon, and people will refer to that also as citizen science, because it's a way of thinking how to bring the science that's done usually in the lab and may take years before you hear a description of what the science is doing and what kind of results. It's actually a way to bring the general public much closer in time, as well as actually in terms of understanding to ongoing science. And so a very good example of that is this game called Fold It. Anybody has played Fold It? Ah, Liliana, yes. A few people, great. So Fold It, like Galaxy Zoo, is one of the most famous gamification project in the recent years. Similar time, it was started quite a few years ago. So it has gone, like Galaxy Zoo, through already a history. The first versions are not as interesting and good-looking as the later versions. Here, the problem is a much more complicated problem than Galaxy Zoo. And you can notice that by the number of people who regularly will engage with the game. It's a much smaller number. So the problem is related to what I showed you in the video before. They're specializing on that particular problem of how this protein, this shoelace, as it's produced by reading DNA, is then folding in space and that folding will create a molecular structure which will have particular properties. And this is really the beginning of understanding life at the cellular level. So your cells, every cells of your body are producing constantly proteins, and these proteins are the first thing they do is they fold in space and take a particular form, and that will largely direct what this protein can do. Essentially, how does it interact with the rest of the world in the cell. The science of understanding how nature solves this problem of always folding a particular sequence into a given form is not resolved. And because it's one of the fundamental problems of biology, people have spent years and years, thousands of scientists are working still today on this problem and making slow progress. The data is accumulating, and it's a bit like the astronomy situation. In the recent years, since the 90s, genomics made such advances that it became a big data problem. Lots and lots of data piling up, and it keeps piling up faster and faster. You may have heard that it looks like within a few years now, all of us will be able to afford to have ourselves being sequenced and know about our DNA and how it relates to the production of these cells. So the data is there's just going to be more anyway. So it's the same problem. How can science deal with this problem while it's still slowly moving forward in understanding the nature of the problem? Engage with the people, turn it into a game, and this is this fold it. Now, when it started, and I remember, so you see the years 2005, and you saw that we had an application with Imperial College, specialists in this field, in 2007. So we started to work with them around 2006. So it's a similar period, and I remember clearly we were mentioning, hey, look at Foldit. Maybe we should do the same. We should think like them and move our problem towards the public and maybe attract them and help us. And it was a no. They thought this was a ridiculous approach. Until about 2011, because in 2011, the team behind Foldit published a paper in Nature. So Nature being one of the most important journals for science, especially bioscience, in the world, this changed the game, literally. Game-changing moment. And from that time on, the specialists we work with suddenly realized, whoa, this is serious. Actually, you can produce real scientific results with this gamification idea. And this was such a game changer for us that, in fact, they told us, yes, let's think of another problem where we have also similar situation, lots of data, very important problem. The science is not well understood. Let's turn this into a project. And about a year and a half ago, the BBSRC, which in the UK is the main research council devoted to bioscience, had a call, and similarly, at the research council level, they noticed that this Foldit project had an impact in real science, and they decided to call for proposals to propose a project which is similar. In fact, I remember in their call they were specifically mentioning Foldit as a good example. So we proposed to look at the next problem in complexity after folding, which is protein docking. So once you have a protein that has taken its form in 3D space, the next thing it will likely do is it will communicate or collide with another molecule. Often it's another protein. So that problem is also another fundamental step in understanding life at the level of cells. And we call it Dockit, the project. So it's sort of in honor of Foldit. And you can think of it as it's like a 3D Tetris, a 3D version of Tetris with much more complicated shapes. And we're just starting the project, so I cannot exactly tell you what it's going to be like playing this game in the next few years. But you should imagine that it's going to be something like smashing these sort of meteorite-like shapes together, and then combine. Most likely, what we're going to end up doing, we're all already talking about it, is the human will do the complicated, what we think is the complicated step, which is bring these molecules in close correspondence. And once you have a potential good solution, the computer will take over and do the very fine, sort of friction-based fine adjustments. And the shapes looks, well, this is one possible way of visualizing this problem. So what you see here is two proteins, one showed in green, the other in blue. And we're also here in transparency showing you one of the classical visualization. But the shape that we are dealing with is more like this outer boundary. So think of it, yes, as like a meteorite-like shape. And often, so there are different situations, but what you see in the middle here is water molecules. So you may have situations where you have other interfering molecules. So the problem has different levels of difficulty. So even now we're thinking in terms of, when we think of the problem, we actually relate to how you would design a game. And we're already thinking of levels. So we'll start with very simple situation, first level, and we will walk the user through different levels towards the more complex, perhaps unsolved problems, as Foldit did. Hence, maybe one day it will help science, hopefully. In any case, I can tell you that for sure it's going to help the citizen science side. So we already know that this kind of application will have definitely an impact in bringing the science and making it hopefully more interesting to the general public. And so at the moment, we have these kinds of visualizations, and basically we're trying to explore whether we can extend what we did before in this context, but we're not sure that this will stay current. So since I was talking a lot now about bringing the crowds or bringing the citizen into, for example, science in the context of games or playful interactions. There is more to say about what can you get from the game industry. Again, in that domain of engaging with the crowds, the game industry is far ahead of anybody else. Perhaps, yes, it's still the case, the most successful crowd-based game, so a game where you play against other players all around the planet, is World of Warcraft. Anybody plays World of Warcraft? More people. That makes sense, because there's a lot more people. Millions of people are playing World of Warcraft. Started a long time ago, and it's been, again, through many generations. Typical situation. Very successful games tend to be like a Hollywood movie into a series, and new versions come out. Yeah, today you have millions of people registered. There's more and more. There's more than millions of characters in the games, because this is the kind of game where the area of AI has a big impact, and there's a lot of NPCs, non-playing characters that you find in the games. And this is the kind of artistry that you find in these games. This is more of a type of game which is influenced by the Dungeon and Dragon tradition from before the time of computer games. So more like fantastic world type of situation. So this is basically I gave you hopefully the main gist of the main ideas I wanted to pitch today. That computer games is really has a vast potential of impacting in different disciplines outside of just the computer game industry. There is a second part now, but I'm going to go a bit faster because I know time is running out. I wanted also to give you a little more details on how the game industry itself is changing. I've mentioned that a few times in my talk already, but I want to actually illustrate it and make it clearer for you. So this is already an old picture, but this is giving you a view on how is this industry evolving. And when you look at the complexity here, the complexity is multiple, it's budgets, right? Here we're talking of tens of millions. This is a few years ago. You'll see in another slide that now we're talking of hundreds of millions. This is for the more sophisticated games. Today, people will make games also with just a few hundreds or thousands of euros. For example, simple puzzle games on an iPhone won't cost you millions, because otherwise you just go bankrupt. But the more complicated games are in that space, and combined to that, the computer power keeps going up rapidly. The computer power that's made available to these games, and so this is why, while in the past games industry was not driving the agenda in graphics, but today it is, because they're one of the industries that has the highest demands on hardware. And this probably will keep going for a while. So yeah, typical game in the early days of game was really, you needed at least these two characters. They could have been in one person. You needed someone good at art, and you needed someone good at programming. It's still true today. But today, you will have games with hundreds of people. For example, trying to remember now, Ubisoft, Assassin's Creed, I forget if it's the latest or 3, but they had up to 600 something people working on that game at the peak of pressure. And that's the kind of game that they will work on for a few years. It will take a few years. It's like you can think of like a Star Wars type movie. It's the same kind of length, or Avatar movie. Many years, hundreds of people. And this keeps evolving in that direction. And here are some reasons for that. The technology, yes, the technology is improving, definitely. So better technology, you can do more with it. The public, so the consumer, if you think of the public as a consumer, there's a lot of competition. So your competitor is introducing some new effect, you have to be aware of it, and eventually you have to introduce it, or you have to do something beyond what they're doing. Animation, yes, animation has changed a lot in the last few years, and this is partly because nowadays another discipline is starting to impact graphics and games, and that's the field of computer vision. So there is some computer vision using mainly camera systems that are impacting, and especially animation. That is, you probably have heard of motion capture. You put human characters in a scenery with lots of cameras around, and you capture all the movements, and you will use these to drive animation of non-playing characters later, so that they have movements that are believable. And again, we could say more about that. There are companies who do only that. For example, in London, recently there's a new company. It's called the Imaginarium. It was founded by an actor, Serkis. This is the person who did the movements for King Kong, for Gollum. So he actually started his own studio, and he started to feed the demand for film. But actually, when we went to talk to him, he told us that now some of his clients are game people, because the game people are also using the same technology now to produce animations for their characters. So yes, we had the lonely programmer back in the 80s doing relatively simple coding. And nowadays, this is a more accurate description of a team like you would find at Ubisoft. Of what a programmer might be. So actually there's a lot of specialization, and we could go through all of these. So I'll just leave you a few seconds to read them, just to get a feel of the differences. And they're all sort of influenced by the demands of games. So when we say, for example, AI programmer, it's the AI in the context of a game. the AI in context of a game, artificial intelligence, is mainly about character behavior and character navigation. So it's a subset of general AI. Same thing for physics, etc. You have lots of, you have people who specialize in build. Build here is that a typical game, every day, they will make sure that all the contributions, imagine you have hundreds of people, about a third of, so you have a 600 team, about 200 of them might be programmers. Every day there's a lot of new things that are happening to your code. It has to be tested, it has to be introduced in the build that will work. And the only way this remains tractable in a long-term project is by checking every day that the code doesn't fail dramatically. So you have what they call build engineers and compliance engineers. These are people who take care of that. In fact, something to mention here, in terms of the quality of software production, I would say that game industry is definitely one of the most sophisticated industry in software today. So this is much more sophisticated, for example, than what Microsoft will do in non-games application, because you cannot accept serious failures. When you're playing a game, you've paid for it and you want real-time interactions, dramatic failures will actually kill your product. The other thing to say about that is that usually most of the games make their money in the first weeks of release. So at that point, any major flaws at the start of that release, and you're just not going to make money back. You cannot allow that to happen. The artist situation is similar. Lots of specialization. Why 2D, 3D artists? Well, 2D means more like painting. So this is artists that focus on what we call textures. You can think of them more, it's closer to painting type of art. 3D artist is more creating the geometry, sophisticated geometry, for example, for characters. And then you have hierarchies in these teams. So yes, you do have directors, managers. Same thing with programmers. And you see definitely lots of variations. Visual effects would be what you find in film as well. So smoke, fluids, these kinds of effects. GUI, so just so those are not familiar, that's the graphical user interface. So that would be, there's a similar important character for programmer. These are people who actually are developing tools for the company. So these tools, the company builds software, builds often their own tools, and those tools are used for years and then are improved over years. So there are actually people who specialize not only on the programming aspect, but actually the look and feel, because you have potentially hundreds of people using these tools all the time. It has to be very high quality. So that's the kind of specialization. And then we have all these other disciplines. I would say that today in a typical game, if you take 100 people, there's about a third programmer, a third on art, and then the other third is a mixture of these characters. QA here is not questions and answers, but quality assurance. So again, I told you the software, very high quality, probably one of the industries that have the highest level of quality in software production. They have lots of people testing the software, the games, constantly. So people specialize in that, in fact. And you can even have a lead of a team for quality assurance. And so, yes, like a movie, you'll have very, very long credits. Lots and lots of people have contributed to sophisticated games such as Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed. Ubisoft Assassin's Creed, by the way, is a type of violent game, but from a history and architectural point of view, it's a very advanced game. They build very believable environments in historical context. The next in that series will apparently be in the context of the French Revolution. So we'll see what that looks like. I mentioned budgets. have been increasing. So this is a very recent figure, probably quite accurate. These are the kinds of budgets. So compare that to Hollywood. Very similar budget for the biggest Hollywood movie. You have similar budgets for games. This is only development. If you think of marketing, most of these games double that amount. A game like Grand Theft Auto 5 made $1 billion in the first week. I forget how many days it took. I think it was just a few days, 1 or 2 days. I forget. The game industry today is much bigger than the film industry. That's the worldwide situation. And those two industries became level only a few years ago. So again, get the sense that this industry is extending, and part of it is because there are new potentials. We describe many of them. Even in the future, there's still many areas to explore. One of the most recent big market was the mobile platform. So with the iPhone and then later the tablets, that became a new platform for games. Another recent new platform is the social media. So a large part of what people do, for example, on Facebook, you probably know that, is play specialized games that work under that kind of an environment. So this is partly why this industry keeps extending. Yes, and then they do have to evolve or basically die. So again, to get a feeling about that, this is going back to our friends at Rebellion. So one of their series, quite successful, is Alien versus Predator. So this is the look and feel you had back then. And this is the look and feel more recently. Even more dramatic, going a bit more back in time. So I remember these games. That was more of my time. This is what it looks like more recently. EA, Electronic Arts, is the biggest publisher around. Yeah, even possibly more dramatic. This is also quite interesting. I think at the very beginning, Liliana mentioned vision, and we're very interested in vision and perception. So this kind of situation, very, very simplistic and still very, very addictive. And when you start playing it, you can't stop. But this is more like today. So this is reaching cinematographic quality. Yes. So that's a situation today, and you got that sense that the costs are rising and rising. So that industry eventually might be in trouble, because an exponential growth in anything is not good news. So just to conclude, in terms of topics in research now, so another area where we're keen on to develop, including hopefully with Trento University. So one of the hot topics in graphics in the last few years is this thing called procedural modeling. Essentially, here is just to illustrate what we mean by that, is that we have mathematical descriptions that are quite simple, but out of them, by iteration, essentially, you're able to create complexity. So it's complexity for the observer. But if you look at the description, it's very simple. Think DNA sequence, but it produced these very complicated shapes. Yes, at the bottom it mentioned L systems. L systems comes out of biology research, actually, in the late 60s, and has been one of the very rule-based methods used in particular to create automatically trees and plants that look like realistic trees and plants. And more recently, this approach has been also transferred towards architecture, especially the architecture where you have a rule-based description. So think Palladio type of architecture. And we've done a bit of work in that area. So just to give you a feel for what we've been doing in the recent years. This is an illustration, collaboration with UCL, where basically the idea here is you have an urban space, and you want to create a believable map for a city, but you want to have a city which has different styles. You can think of networks. And you can think of these styles as being like patterns. And we need to find a good way to mix them and find ways where the road merge different types, so like the Manhattan type, the the suburb type, and then something like London, and create these new cities that are believable. And this actually is inspired by the field of urban design. And in that context, we've developed tools to help games designer create geometry. In the context of games, they will talk about white boxing. So this is a first step in the design of a game where you create all the geometry of your game, but you don't worry too much about how it looks. And at that level, you may change the architecture, you may make the roads wider, etc. So this is where the designer will still have a huge impact on what happens next. And then the artist comes in and makes it realistic. And if you have problems playing the game at that level, it's very costly because you have to come back, change geometry, and then redo the artistry, right? And so this is one of the reasons the costs keep going up rapidly. So we have to come up with new tools for them and make them able to do this a bit more efficiently. So, and this will be the last thing I show you, I think. Just again, a few videos just to give you a feel for what I mean. So am I going to do this right? So yes, I'll just show you 2 or 3 of these, not all of them. So this is using the map generator you saw before, but it's actually populating it in real time with buildings. And you can think of each building is a rule-based system. It's like there's a DNA for the architecture, and the DNA can be automatically modified, and it's following the map structure, so it adapts to the style of the local architecture as it's modified in real time. So this is an automatic version. And if you think of a game designer and game artist, they actually want full controller on this kind of software. So it's not good enough to have sophisticated software that generates lots of interesting content. You have to allow the software to be stopped at any time and then give power to the artist or designer to go and modify whatever they want. Otherwise, they're not going to use your software. So you have to be very aware of who's the user. And again, here at that level, it doesn't have to look realistic. This will come later. Whoops, sorry. So, yeah, this one is interesting. So this is a gesture. Now, this is a gesture-based interface, and basically here, what we're doing, we're selecting a building and applying some of its features, like its style, to the other buildings. Or here, we're going to apply the same height. Each building has its own style, but now is homogeneous in terms of height, for example. And you can give that power to the designers. Here they're doing this kind of gesture to adapt the size. So instead of classically, you would maybe give an interface where you put some numbers. You're not dealing with menus and all that. You're actually dealing with something which is more like drawing gestures. So much more natural for artist or designer. And in the end, once you iterated this way with these tools, then eventually you produce a final good-looking version. So this is what, with these tools that I just illustrated a few of them, this is the kind of quality you reach. But you might recognize some of the geometry from the previous buildings. Some of the effects are produced by other software, like the trees, the smoke, etc. So this kind of quality is what they call demo quality. So it's like an architect. This is the quality they will use to try to win the contract. They will present this quality to their client. It's good enough. But later, this would even be refined. You can see that it's almost spotless. And so there's a lot that could be done to make it even more believable. But at that level, with these tools, if you want to change something, it's quite easy to do. Yeah, so just to end, again, thanks to Trento University, Liliana in particular, for inviting me here. I also want to mention a few other people that had a big impact on some of what you saw. William Latham is my main collaborator at Goldsmith in the space of games. He himself had his own studio in the 90s, and through him we were able to bring lots of contacts from industry and build up this activity. Stephen Todd is a researcher that was at the IBM Research Center, and with his son Peter Todd, they were the main programmers in the folding interface that you saw, including some of the tools used at the end for building urban scapes. Michael Sternberg is a well-known academic in the area of proteins, and obviously is one of our most important collaborators in the Docket project that you will hear more, I hope, in the near future. Anthony Steed was involved in the urban planning project, and Rebellion provided quite a few of the art that you saw today. So I wanted to mention that. Thank you. There's a question there.
So
Yes.
I want to go back to the point of getting serious with games.
Yes.
So do you think there's a lexical problem in that we still call them video games while we have some very clear examples that they're not games anymore, but it's kind of more an interactive product, which is not necessarily a game?
Yeah. So I think it's a valid point, and I try to avoid video games as a term nowadays. I talk about computer games, and once you look at some of these applications, where is the game aspect? It becomes smaller and smaller, and it's unclear. So perhaps this term of gamification will stick. I'm not sure. That's why I mentioned at the beginning, it's kind of a fuzzy concept. It's still early days. And there's so many ways this can be interpreted that maybe other words will be more descriptive. But definitely video games is becoming an old term in terms of what is a game today. Also, it's not linear like a video anymore. It's very non-linear. And the user more and more has potential to influence what happens next. So if you compare, this is where we briefly mentioned narratives and literature impact, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge for literature field, I think, to consider the world of games, because in the world of games you can do non-linear storylines, and also you could introduce unexpectedness. Because we have the technology to create, by combining storyboards elements, you can potentially reach the point where the system can start generating, a bit like we generate trees and buildings. You could generate little chunks of storylines, and they could be believable. In fact, that's a research topic nowadays. If you look at the type of conferences that exist nowadays around games, automatic generation of narratives is a hot topic. The results are not very convincing, but it means that people are working in that direction. So non-linearity, very important. Maybe non-linearity will be one of these words that we'll have to think to introduce. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks for bringing together all these aspects. I was wondering, since we are in the faculty of literature, whether you would have something to say on the topics of the story, because I mean, one of the results of the budget situation you displayed is that these games cannot fail. So when you make these sort of games, Grand Theft Auto, for instance, you spend so much that you want to make sure that they reach a wide public. The result is a set of games that look very much like you know, the sort of colossal high-budget movie that Hollywood makes. Primarily games where there is a lot of shooting, a lot of fighting with big monsters and that sort of thing. This is clearly a limit. And I think that one of the big challenges for the industry is to overcome this limit. This limit is also visible in the sort of audience they attract. In this room, and this is a faculty which has a lot more women than men, look at the number of women here, I think that that's already telling. I would be curious if you had comments on the type of, on the gender, the proportions of genders who actually play these games,
yes,
including the science games.
Yes.
Well, that's it.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's an excellent point to raise, and yes, I'm sorry I didn't go in that direction in the presentation yet, so thanks for the question. So if you had asked me or made that point about 10 years ago, or let's say around 2000, it would have been really a strong critique of what was the situation. But during the year 2000s, the situation has changed dramatically. So maybe it's not as well known because, again, those big games which tend to be like Hollywood type, they have also the biggest marketing budget. And they were also the first to go after marketing as you would with a big movie. So they are more visible. But in terms of diversity and number of games that are available, they're actually a minority of the type of games that you can go after. So I try to give a little bit of hint of that, for example, by emphasizing that now there are companies specializing in for games for kids. And kids actually of different ages. And this is all very recent. It's all in the last 10 years or so that it has become a sustainable type of business. So the topic of women, the woman here probably could tell us, but it has also started to change. Maybe it's not yet equilibrium, but one of the big changes was when devices like Kinect arrived, or the Wii. So this made possible a very different type of game. And these devices turn out, after by experience, to be more relevant to games that are where you are active. So you saw games suddenly becoming very popular, like dancing games, sport games, and in that type of game, the gender differences, there's no real differences. I don't have statistics recent statistics in my head now, because I haven't looked it up. I should have. Recently, but I remember reading that already a few years ago, there were these specialized type of games where actually the difference in gender was not apparent anymore. And so I think it's getting much better. It has improved a lot, but again, if you're not following too closely what's happening, it's clear that from the outside, because of the budgets that are spent on marketing by these big ones, like Hollywood. It's the same situation as film. I mean, you have a situation in film where you have all these small budget films that you may never hear of, or the documentaries. It's the same situation in games. And I would think that it's just going to keep democratizing this way. For example, because we have also multiple types of platforms. So another illustration, or trying to convince you that it's a bit better than what it used to be, is the impact of mobile platforms. So from 2007 on, because of the quality, graphical quality and interaction, touch interaction on the new devices, they generated a new industry, because it was mainly, especially initially, even today, it's mainly 2D type of visualization. So it requires its own expertise. And also it's using this touch interface. So it was an opportunity for new companies to come. And in that space, a lot of the games have nothing to do with those big budget shooting. Most of the games are more like puzzles. And again, in that space, lots of games for kids, more educational. So that kind of new platform, also a bit like the gesture one, has helped to basically democratize and make it more generic.
I think that there is a very important difference which is not always stressed. This is the fact that a film lasts 2 hours.
Yes.
Okay, but a video game can take months to solve. Okay? This means that the market can be saturated by a much higher number of films and video games. I mean, you can watch 7, 8, 10 films a week. But you cannot play 10 different video games a week. I mean,
Well, some people do, but I would not necessarily recommend it.
you film 24 hours per day.
Yes.
And that is a big problem. It means that the competition for time is going to be the important force behind it. So, and yeah.
Yeah, again, I think it's what you're describing is accurate for a part of the market out there, and again, probably was more of an issue a few years ago. And you have people who only play certain type of games. For example, some people only play when they take the tube in London, the underground on their tablet, and then they work and they don't play. So there's a relationship with games which can be quite specific and quite different, and also it's all very recently happening, so we may not be aware. So the people who play those kinds of games, they will play hundreds of time, either the same game or explore. They get bored and then explore other games. In fact, in that market, this is the mobile market. Is the market where you see the most. It's the most prolific. So games there have a very short-term life, and in fact, it's very hard to make money out of them. And that's also so because of that, the budgets and the sophistication is much reduced because you cannot afford these things sort of go together. But again, I think more recently, it's been with respect to these criticism. I think the situation is more interesting, at least. How does it compare to film? It doesn't obviously replace film. I do see that there could be a near future, I could imagine, where a film and a game are one and the same. So that you could experience an entertainment which you would maybe have the problem we were discussing before. Is it a film or is it a game? So Avatar, for example, was trying to pitch again the idea of experiencing a movie in 3D, right? I don't think we're quite there in terms of support of 3D. But if we get there, then there will be one less barrier between something like a film or even a book and something like a game. But that's the near future. It's not there yet.
There's a question about the types of professionals involved in the construction of a game. Could you go back to the slide with all the people?
Yes. Thank you.
Can you say something more about the storyboard part? How did it work? Write story.
Very much like a film. So people will tend to draw a lot of ideas of characters, sort of a sketch. It's a lot about a sketch, and they will generate new concepts. That step is very early in the design of games, and we'll go through iterations. So that step is very classical, and I'm not aware that it's changed in terms of whether there's new technology to support that step. So it would be a sort of a typical story.
I mean, is there a writer in the place? I mean, the part of the team, is it part of the team, or they contacted a writer outside of the team and they ask him for ideas and stories?
I think you will see both. So there's a lot. Bigger companies tend to have their own people and tend to hire long-term and all the specialties. And smaller companies tend to outsource. They call that outsourcing. And they will outsource potentially all the possible functions. So some of their teams, for example, the art domain, some of them will be in, and some of them will be outsourced. So, same thing for programming. Same thing for the design of levels. So it depends. It depends of the company. It depends of the constraints, budget. My own knowledge of it, and it's not like this is my focus, but what I'm aware is that you will see at least those two extremes. So one of the reasons there's a lot of outsourcing is because of the risks they have, financial risks. The other thing that happens is in the last few years there's a tendency for companies to get bigger because they're to absorb the risk. It used to be that a successful studio would do one game at a time, maybe two. But now, because some of these games are very large budget, take many years, they do games in parallel to reduce that risk. So because the games are not, even though they're running in parallel, they're not at the same stage, they have fluctuating demands between all these functionalities. And that's one of the reasons there's quite a lot of outsourcing.
The question about that slide is, how many of those figures may have received their education within a department of humanities, like the one in which we are today?
Yes.
I mean, could you be able to present the situation today, at present, and how it is likely to evolve in future? The question basically is, would this department help educate people who are then going to work within the game industry or not?
Well, I would say yes. And I would say, in fact, the game industry as it has evolved was never recognized until very recently, at least at the university, well, at education in general, as a discipline in which you offer a specialty. So most of the people working in the game industry today, and especially the ones that have been in it for a number of years, they went through regular pathways, and you will find people with all kinds of degrees, yes, degrees in literature, yeah, that end up going in this area, usually by personal interest. But now we are at the time where you see starting happening that degrees are being specialized in these areas. So for example, when we started in London, we were the first master's degree focusing on programming. There were already a few on art and design. And so this was, we designed the course in 2007 and we launched in 2008. So it's not so long ago. So even though London is one of the world hubs for this industry and other related industries like special effects, there were no master's degree up till that time specialized for this industry. So today, yes, again, the most of the people that you see in the industry just went through pathways which are traditional pathways. So is it? So in a way, it's very successful industry. Maybe we don't need to change the way we educate people. So that's a question, and that's, you know, I think the best answer for that is if you go to people in the game industry and you ask them that question. So ourselves, although here today I try to give you the widest possible view or views, including covering the main disciplines involved in creating game, we focus on the programming side, so I have a lot more understanding of that situation. And we know that there's a high demand, and in particular in the UK, they don't find enough people ready to fill the positions they have. So they are human resource. I didn't list that in the, you know, all the different part of a game studio. Human resource is very, very important. And definitely the people who work at human resources are very well paid. And there is a constant flow. They interview people constantly. And part of the reason is, yes, they're growing, but part of the reason is because it's so successful, there's a lot of transfer. People get offers and they leave, and they leave with their expertise, so it's difficult to replace them. So at least what I know about the programming side is clear that they need help. And I would think, but it's better to go ask them directly, that it's the same situation in the other main disciplines.
So I'm still tempted to quit the job as a teacher and become a concept artist.
I would say yes, do that, because if you do that, then to launch a degree, a well thought and well delivered degree at our level, we need people like what you described. So in our case, we made the decision from the start that we would have some people from industry hired to impact on the delivery of the course. We also contacted people in the industry to create the curriculum and all these things that you would do anyway. But we took the step of, we wanted on our team to always have at least 1 or 2 people which have a foot in the industry by their experience. And in our case, we have 1 person who's half-time with us, half-time with Sony currently, and they're delivering the hardcore, the more programming-oriented modules. William Latham, as I said, had his own studio, and he still today does a lot of consulting. Working with him, I've started to do consulting, so I'm starting to get more knowledge. But I think that's very important, especially probably in this early phase. If you're designing something new, you will need the input. So either you go, a few years and then you come back, or you do a sort of part-time, so you get the knowledge, or you hire the other way. You do it the other way. I would recommend. That would be my recommendation, but it's also based on, that's our experience. And we're quite happy. Yes?
How about, you talked about new technology in interaction
Yes.
with games, and there is a big step now with VR technology.
Oh yeah.
Like we had, last week Sony presented this.
Yes. I don't know if this is working. Yeah, sorry, I'm smiling because we were discussing this yesterday.
Yes, and there is Oculus Rift, which
Yes.
is quite cheap and made by a
Yeah.
very small company. And
Yeah.
do you think this will change somehow something, or
Yeah.
it's just an improvement, or will be useful also in the gamification?
Yeah, thank you. This is really, yes, this is very current, very hot topic, another hot topic in fashion. So I have my own view of this, and I'm rather negative about it. I could be wrong. The reason is there is a past of VR trying to become a market or impacting on other markets, and I think Oculus Rift is already showing signs that they have the similar problem they've had in the past. So the main problem I think that they have to try to resolve, and I'm not convinced they have resolved that main problem. They've worked on making it very high quality and, as you said, cheap. So that's big success. But I think they're missing one thing, is that VR is not easily a natural way of interacting. The main reason is you have usually it's used with 3D percept and a lot of movement, or you are invited to move around. But usually, precisely, you cannot move around, right? Often you won't move around. And there's a conflict between what the Oculus, for example, gives you as an experience and the physicality of your movements. So for most people, it creates headaches. And even you have the same phenomenon with 3D movie stereo. So you will notice, for example, in Avatar was quite clear, you would have quite a lot of depth at the beginning, and as the movie go on, there's less and less and less. At the end, you could even remove. And part of the reason is that they know that if they have too strong movements with 3D and you're sitting and not moving, the usual statistic is like about half the people rapidly start having a headache. And I've heard reports that Oculus is suffering from that. So that's why I'm kind of hesitating. But maybe they have, hopefully they've thought of that. And now we see Sony joining the bandwagon. So maybe they have something mysterious we don't know about. But I'm skeptical. However, this is, I think, a good illustration where, again, I mentioned that a few times that the game industry is driving the agenda in hardware. Well, this is a very good example of that. Because for them, the killer app is games. Or that's what they say.
I have a question regarding sonification.
Sonification, yes.
I like the recent development in the music soundtracks of the game. That they're having a more dynamic approach. I think about Amon Tobin's Splinter Cell theory, which are like little bits of music that are merging together in order to fit the action that is actually going on.
Yes.
So it's something completely different from the static movie soundtrack.
Yes.
And they are changing the approach to the music itself in that direction.
Yes.
If you can explain a little.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in this area, but yes, what I try to say, what I'm aware is that there is a lot more could be done in the context of games with sonification music than what has been done in the past, because I think it's a bit like what you described. In the past, people have approached it as it's like in the movie, it's an add-on, it's something, it's like an effect, like a visual effect. But as you started to illustrate, yes, it could be much more interesting, it could be dynamic, it could be reactive. Also with music technology now, you can give actually very good 3D percepts of space. You can actually manipulate sound and give you the illusion of being in a particular 3D space, and that's a much softer impression of experiencing 3D than the sort of violence of a visual Oculus, I would say. So I have big hopes on the impact of music and sonification to bring a lot more in the next few years. But the best would be to look at what the experts in that field are doing, to see where might you go with this. So, for example, at Goldsmith we have a strong team in that domain, and I know of an interesting tool. It's called the Moogie. So essentially, it's a device. It's a small device that you connect to your computer remotely, and it perceives vibrations. So you can interact with the computer, but you're not. So it's a remote interaction, and you start any slight movement you do will be interpreted by this device and portrayed to you with dynamic sound effects. And now this is it's coming out of research, so it's almost on the verge of becoming a product. So that, those kinds of interesting little devices could definitely play an interesting role in the game and type of interaction. Another one that you may have seen in the last year or two is something called leap motion. Anybody has heard? Yes, some of you. So this is, again, it's a small device about that size, and you put it, and it has to connect to your computer. You put it in front of you, and basically it tracks your fine movements, and it's able to distinguish between fingers, or they're refining that at least. And you can do very, very tiny movements, and it's tracking that. So you compare that to sort of the Kinect, where you have to do all these kinds of things, and you get tired after a few seconds. This is actually a very interesting new device, because you can imagine that you may want to combine this with acting with a keyboard or something else, and you may be able to sustain an interesting interaction. So again, who knows what will be the near future of how we interact with computers and in particular games. But I think the games will probably always play an interesting role because it's available and interesting to a lot of people. It will try, like the Oculus, it will try to sort of demonstrate, in a way maybe it will always demonstrate, is this going to work? Yeah, sorry, a bit of a long answer.
Yeah, and
sound design. They had a very good example of dynamic sound generation last year during the ICT days.
Okay.
At the Museum of Science, there is a research group in Poland, which is actually researching this kind of things. So
Yes.
I think that they will have another presentation
Yes.
in the first days of April. So do check it out if you have the chance. And also, this is a problem which is related to work of some musicians, like British musician Brian Eno, who worked on, he called it something like dynamic generation of sound. And he was a pioneer in this field. The point is that the real challenge is trying not to make the sound loopy, because you usually use piano textures or something like that. And if you're not very careful, you make some loopy sounds that basically sounds very repetitive. Well, but my other question was back to the serious approach to games. How do you think we as future designers maybe could make games something regarded as serious as movies or books? Because nowadays, if you say, well, I'm playing a video game or a computer game, nobody takes you seriously. While if you're saying, I watched a movie or I read a book, you look much smart in the eyes of your peers. So how do you think we could solve this problem?
Yeah, so, okay. Was the first part also a question?
No, the first part was
a comment. Thank you. Yeah, so again, I have a feeling this is more of a perception issue, and I would say, well, let your generation become the main generation, because at your generation and younger generation, but even people a bit older, I think there's quite a lot of people who take games as very serious, and there are some games that are, well, we mentioned the word serious games just before. There's lots of games that are historical games, and they are actually quite sophisticated, and they will hire historians to make sure that this is, they have a Napoleon war game. It has a lot to do on actually the knowledge of what happens during certain battles, and people are interested in playing battles that relate to something historically valid. And again, also today I try to illustrate that there is this huge impact on new generations of kids impacted by games, and one of the main roles they play is in education. It's developing, it's early days. But that, I mean, for me, that's very serious and potentially very useful. But obviously, if you grow up with this around you, only in a few years will you consider it. You'll be amongst peers, and you won't have maybe this issue of saying, "Yeah, I'm not doing something very serious here." It's a bit like saying previous generations was playing chess. Was that a serious activity? It became a serious activity. Is it really a serious activity? It became a serious activity because you had generations of people playing it, and there's a history. There's a good story to tell about it. It's challenging, or used to be. I think a similar thing. It's perception. I think. Well, it's up to us really also to change how games are perceived. It's early days. I mean, my message would be we're still in the infancy of computer games. And it's why I say that, because I hope I gave you an idea today that it keeps evolving rapidly. I used the word evolve a few times. So where exactly is it going to stabilize and become part of mainstream life? And at that moment, maybe that question won't be asked. I don't know. It might be in many more years. But also we can drive the agenda. So go into games and turn it into something very interesting. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Going back to virtual reality, do you think it could be an example of a technology developed with games in mind that could become useful in other fields. For example, I don't know, computer-aided design, 3D things, or maybe simulating things that you can't do in reality. For example, I don't know, training surgeons or things like that, and so become useful in a field different from games.
Thank you for the question. Yes, so I would be more, but this is my personal opinion. It's not an expert's opinion at that point. I have a better feeling for what you describe. So I think VR technology has more future in those type of applications you describe. Again, I think for me, personally, the main issue I think is this problem of the conflict between very strong visual inputs given to you in 3D, and you don't have the correspondence in terms of movement. So in your brain, you probably know that you have this internal ear. It's actually like a gyroscope. It has this shape, and it tells you exactly. It's like your mobile phone has a positioning device. Well, you have that device in your brain, and if it's in conflict, why do we get seasick? It's in conflict. We have perceptions that are in conflict with the movements. So for me, that's the main challenge. It was the challenge. VR was pitched big time in the 90s, early 90s. We discussed the topic of a cave. Maybe some of you know what a cave is. A cave is this iterative definition. A cave is a cave augmented virtual environment, something like that. So this basically, the idea is you have a small room and you have 3D projections, you're tracking the movements, and so if you do this, the imagery changes with you. And so this has been around for a long time, and it's not really having a huge impact yet. And I think it's always because of this physiological problem. So until this is addressed, I would think there's going to be barriers. So in the cases you mentioned, like training surgeons, I could see that it would be useful because you could, a bit like with the proteins, you could give ways to navigate through a body maybe. If you can do that well, and if you think about this issue of movement not in correspondence with the visual percepts, then maybe it will really have an impact. So perhaps. I'm not aware that there are really products out there that do that yet. So for example, in surgery, what I think is more developing is robotics and giving what they call haptics. So it is part of virtual reality. It's giving you the virtual sense of touch. That's already having a huge impact. But the visual side is still, I mean, it looks great, right? The usual illustration of that is the holodeck in Star Trek, right? You go there and everything is virtual and you can walk around and experience. And people keep coming back with this illustration. They want to reproduce that. So it's a bit of a fantasy, and it's producing, I think, things like Oculus Rift to come around again. But they haven't really addressed the main issue. That's my own opinion. Yes?
As you were talking about virtual reality,
yes.
What do you think about augmented reality, about that problem about of movement and
Yes.
things? Do you see an application for that technology on gaming?
Yeah, so thanks. I didn't mention that, but so I mean, I didn't think of going in that direction. But yes, augmented reality. I think I'm much more positive about that type of device. And of course, we all have heard of Google Glass coming about, maybe. And in augmented reality, because of the concept, you can see that you're going to combine it with something which is much more natural. We can all wear glasses, so we're going to add some information on what is available to us from our glasses as a support. But you will be allowed to do natural movements, even though you're augmenting the world. So I don't think there's going to be as much issues of the issues we have with VR, which is a disconnect. There's a disconnect in VR between you and the reality that's portrayed. So I think augmented reality has definitely a high potential. Now, is there killer application games? That I don't know. When you look at what Google says, or other companies now are trying to launch their own product, they talk more about information and giving you the news, or you're walking around and you see information about a restaurant or these kinds of things. So that seems to be more their killer application initially. So the potential for games has to be invented.